Hey, it's Andy Bush here. A quick thanks to everybody who was listening last week, as we had over 1,000 downloads from about 25 different countries. Pretty cool. But before we get started this week, I wanted to let you know that the next guest has been confirmed by the Senate and awaits his swearing in as chairman. Unfortunately, we recorded the show right before the Senate confirmed him, and so we call him acting chairman in the podcast. Sorry about that. Just a heads up, in case you were wondering. Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush. In a minute, we're going to be talking to a man who's had a very busy travel schedule recently. He's been to Kansas, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, New York, Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio. What did he do there? He milked cows. He checked out a drone flying around a farm. He climbed up a grain silo. He went inside a nuclear power plant, and then he went underground into a coal mine. Who does this kind of stuff? Today, we're going to be speaking with acting chairman of the CFTC, Chris Giancarlo. Just a quick reminder, there's a disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to hear. But let's get to this well-traveled man. Chris, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Andy. Thanks.
Now, you've covered a lot of territory recently for the agency: cows, drones, and coal. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a man who's the acting chairman for the CFTC, an independent federal agency whose mission is to open and foster transparent, competitive, and financially sound markets. Not farms, but markets. So given this, Chris, why did you go to all those places, and what were some of the fun things you got to do there?
Well, I went to all those places because at the end of the day, these markets have to serve real people with real needs. These markets started out in the ag futures area. That's basically a marketplace where farmers and ranchers that have real risk of production costs as well as price risk can what we call hedge or control that risk, limit that risk. But they've grown much beyond farming. They've grown into the energy sector, which is why I've been to coal mines and why I've been to nuclear plants and electric plants. They've grown into areas of precious metals, of foreign exchange, foreign currency, and now the world's biggest markets in interest rates and credit risk. The reason why we in America enjoy a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage as a standard tool for buying a house is only possible because these enormous interest rate markets exist so that our lending banks can give us a fixed rate while they bear and then trade the risk of floating rates. Because as you know, over 30 years, interest rates are moving up and down. They're not staying steady as they are in our mortgages.
Right. So, okay, but what are some of the fun things? Now, I know you did some, I've never been in a coal mine. Right. I thought that would be kind of cool. That's got to be a little bit scary going all the way down, right?
So take everything you think of a coal mine and throw it out the window.
Okay.
A modern coal mine is a very sophisticated operation. First of all, it's not dark. It's brighter than New York City's Times Square at midnight.
Oh
Why?
My gosh.
LED lighting is transformed coal mining. You can light every square inch of it without creating heat, without needing a lot of electricity.
Oh, yeah.
So that's enormous. Then the ventilation systems are fantastic. The air down there is clearer than the air on a spring day outside. But then with electric vehicles, moving around, the ability to move around. So I was in a coal mine, the Cardinal Coal Mine in western Kentucky. The size of the mine is about 5 or 6 square miles underground, wide, but 9 feet tall.
Holy smokes.
It was once a primeval lake that morphed into coal, and it now exists underground. And the way they do mining is, if you think about a cityscape of, take Manhattan, for example, of streets and avenues, that's the way they mine underground. Where the block of buildings would be is coal holding up the roof. By the way, I was 900 feet underground.
Wow.
And then the streets and the avenues are where they've mined. So it's a massive grid underneath. And the avenues are where the vehicles move up and down. Yeah. And the streets are where the mines go. So you're powering along at 30 miles an hour in some low-slung vehicle, and suddenly you come to a red light, and you stop. And you hear noise, and the noise is a large digging piece of equipment coming across. But anyway, put put away the sides of miners, like the Seven Dwarves with their picks and shovels.
Right.
These guys are engineers underground.
Sure.
They're all carrying handheld electronic instruments. The digging is being done electronically, and they are taking measurements. It's really an amazing experience to go underground in a mine today.
Yeah, you think about, just the electric cars alone helps with not having the exhaust and then the dust and all that other stuff. That's I hadn't thought of it in that way. That's really cool. Well, let me just switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about your background, because I think it's interesting, obviously. You grew up in northern New Jersey, and you went to Skidmore College, but where did you get your law degree from?
I got my law degree in Music City in Nashville, Tennessee, at Vanderbilt Law School.
So country and western fan.
Country western fan, banjo player.
I
love country music.
I was going to get to that. You jumped ahead of me, but yes, Chris recently played at, what was it, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
Rock the Capitol, a benefit in conjunction with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Congressional Rock and Roll Caucus, and in a band called the Second Amendments, led by Congressman Colin Peterson of Minnesota.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, besides practicing law in the U.S. and in London, you worked for Phoenix Software and then GFI Group. How did those experiences, help you and shape your views for your role at the CFTC?
Sure. So I practiced law for 16 years in New York and London, and in 2000, a client firm of mine, Phoenix Software, was being sold to what was then kind of a startup that was building trading systems around the world for something that I had never heard of before, called credit default swaps. I wound up leaving my law practice, joining that firm, and helping them build 18 trading platforms in cities around the world. And then eventually in 2005, we took that firm public. And in 2008, when the financial crisis came, we operated the largest trading platforms for these credit default swap instruments. We were not a trading house. We were a trading platform. We were the exchange for things that didn't trade on an exchange.
Right.
And during the crisis, policymakers wanted to understand how these markets work, and I was invited to testify several times in front of Congress and meet with other policymakers, various federal agencies, on how these swaps markets work, as Congress sought to bring them into a regulatory framework. And I was also an advisor to the Romney campaign and recommended that Congress got Title VII, which is the provision in the Dodd-Frank Act that deals with the swaps market. I said Congress got it right. Now it's up to the regulators, including the CFTC, to get the implementation of those regulations right. Mm-hmm. In 2013, President Obama asked me to join the CFTC to fill a Republican seat on the commission. And then recently, President Trump has asked me to serve as chairman of the agency.
Well, to that end, what are the major differences between being a commissioner and being the chairman?
Yeah. So it's sort of like going from a member of the board of directors to being CEO.
Okay.
As a commissioner, you think about policy, you give input into policy formation, but you're not responsible for running the agency. In fact, the chairman is sort of a misnamed position. Yes, you do chair the commission's meetings of the 5 commissioners, but more importantly, you run the day-to-day operations of the agency. So here is where my experience as an executive, after I left law for 16 years, I then spent 14 years as an executive of that firm, GFI, and many of those years was as a public company. My experience in running a public company with a budget 3 times the size of this agency's budget was very formative to me in the experience I now bring to bear as chairman of the agency, chief executive officer of this fine agency.
That's great. Well, let's talk about being chairman. What's your vision for the agency?
I'd put it simply: operational and regulatory excellence today and tomorrow.
High goals.
High goals, but really the only goals worth having. I learned that in business. If you're not striving to get things right in every way, not just the outcome, but the process, then you're failing. There really has to be only one standard, and that is getting it right. Whether it's the rules we set, whether it's how we interface with our regulated agencies. We want every person, every entity that comes into contact with this agency to come away with saying, wow, those people get it. They're trying to get it right. My experience was one that was respectful, that was workmanlike, that was professional in every way. And that's got to be our goal. And this agency's capable of it.
Well, you talk about interacting with a lot of different groups two of the initiatives that you have, Project KISS and LabCFTC, I believe are along those lines. So let's talk about Project KISS. What's the goal there?
Well, KISS, I don't know whether you heard this phrase growing up, Andy, was one of my dad's favorites. He would say to me when I would come some crazy idea, he would say, "Keep it simple, stupid." KISS, the KISS principle, he would tell me. And you know what? That's a good lesson in life. It's a good lesson in regulation. You know, we've been doing this for 40 years here at the CFTC. The agency was founded in the mid-'70s. And as you can imagine, over time, regulation piles on top of regulation. It's sort of like, it's like my garage. I mean, things are piled up every so often. You've got to go through the garage.
Right.
And think about what really needs to be kept and what kind of is outdated. And in a lot of cases, we've got some outdated regulations. We've got regulations that address technology issues that don't exist anymore. We recently updated a regulation that when it was adopted 15 years ago, the agency thought it was very forward-looking. It required filing by fax machine. Nobody uses faxes anymore, and yet our rule still required filing by fax. Well, we made that technologically neutral because even if it's electronic now, who knows what it's going to be in 10 years. And so regulations that are out of date, regulations that are in some cases duplicative, regulations in some cases that maybe have been poorly drafted. The policy may have been right, but the application was just not ideal. So we're looking at regulation. It's not about changing the underlying principles or even the core regulations. It's the application of them. How do we get the application better? Another example is regulated firms sometimes will explain to a team sent from the agency on a site visit for an exam, "Wow, we just had a team here 2 weeks ago from your agency. We gave them all the information you're asking for."
Right.
Well, why do they have to give it twice?
Right.
So that's what we want to do.
Yeah, it's got to be frustrating from the company standpoint.
Yeah, and how does that help the U.S. economy grow? Right.
Right. It doesn't.
We have legitimate policy objectives, but how can we achieve them in a simpler, more straightforward, keep it simple, stupid fashion? And that's what Project KISS is.
Yeah, and I think what's encouraging is to reach out to the private sector for ideas. And I believe on the website that there's a place that they can go, right?
That's absolutely right. So it's twofold. One is we started internally, and our own divisions came up with dozens of really good ideas. So that's phase one. Phase two is, as you say, we've launched a portal on our website where folks that trade in our markets can give us ideas for how we can make things simpler. That doesn't mean every idea is one that we're going to adopt, but it's a great starting point.
Well, let's talk about LabCFTC. It seems to me that there's been an explosion of entrepreneurism in the financial technology or fintech space. What is the role that the CFTC is trying to fill with LabCFTC? So let me actually back up, Andy, in order to answer this. Let me tell you about another one of my visits around the country where I learned something amazing, and it wasn't a lesson I expected to learn, but it was an amazing lesson, and it's informed how we approach things going forward. Okay. And that was a visit I made to Bardwell, Texas, about an hour and a half south of Dallas, Texas. I was down there because one of our key markets that we oversee is a cotton futures market. And really, I don't know much about cotton. And, the best way to learn is get out there. And so I met with a cotton farmer down there, Bob Beakley, who also operates a local cotton gin, which I wanted to see how that works. And that's what turns cool.
Oh, yeah. Really cool. We were driving past, on the way to the cotton gin. We were passing a field, and it looked like it had just been cut. So I innocently said, and it was this, I was visiting him in, it was May. I said, "Oh, that's interesting. What was that? The field looks like it's just been cut. What was cut?" He said, "Well, that was winter wheat. It's harvesting time for winter wheat." I said, "Oh, interesting." And then he said to me, just offhandedly, "We cut it last night." And as we rode along in his pickup truck, I then responded, rolled around in my brain for a few minutes. I said, "You cut it at night? That's interesting. How'd you cut it at night?" And he said, "Oh, you want to see something cool?" And he pulls his truck over. He takes out his iPhone. He gives it a couple of swipes. And he shows me, at first, what seemed to be a pitch black screen. But then I can make out in the center of it 4 headlights. Mm-hmm. And he explained to me what it was. And it was 2 of the headlights were his combine harvester that was harvesting the wheat. And riding alongside of it was his tractor, which was pulling a cart. And the wheat was being shot over into the cart behind the harvester. And here's what he explained to me. In the pitch of night, the combine was being driven by GPS satellite.
Wow.
The tractor, which was 1 foot exactly away from it, was being held in place by vehicle telemetry. And the whole scene was being videoed by his drone.
Oh, that is just awesome.
He was in the tractor, but not steering it.
Right.
He was taking measurements, measuring the quality of the wheat that was going into the cab. The combine was being driven, as I say, by GPS satellite, but his son was in that. So if you think about this, and as I got on the plane that night and flew back to Washington, I was sort of mulling this over my brain. Think about how revolutionary this is. 2 men in the middle of the night harvesting a field of wheat. Now, farming, an activity that's as old as humans have been on this earth, has always been a daylight activity.
Right.
Now, because of digital technology, it's a 24/7 activity, and it doesn't require a whole village to reap a field. It can be done by 2 men.
Yeah. It's really, the efficiency is just mind-blowing, right?
So now this is a 4,000-acre farm. This is a family business. It's a family budget that can afford this equipment.
Yeah.
If you think about that small budget that can do that, think about our financial markets in which billions of dollars are being deployed and the technology that's there. Yeah. So it's no surprise that if farming has been digitized, the financial markets have been hyper-digitized. Our markets are now 70, 80% driven by algorithmic trading, and increasingly those algorithms are using machine learning to learn from other algorithms. Our markets are becoming iterative. The machines are running the markets. And then if you add to that cloud computing and big data analysis,
right,
and then you add other enhancements like some of this new blockchain technology where these trading ledgers are going to be kept automatically and compared against others, we are going through a digital revolution in our financial markets. And yet as a regulator, Andy, our rule books are still written for a 20th century analog world where men and women traded in trading pits, and yet those trading pits are long closed. So this is a long way of answering your question. LabCFTC is our laboratory where we're going to experiment with some of these new technologies. So the technology doesn't leave us behind as a regulator. We're going to get up to speed on these digital transformations. I don't want to be the farmer who's still reaping his field at night. We want to be as advanced as the advances are taking place in our markets.
Right. And to that end, is it also going to be like the regulatory sandbox that the FCA in London has?
So I've got to give the Brits the highest compliments here. They were way out in front. Just as the United States was way out in front of the internet revolution in the 1990s, I got to say the Brits have gotten out in front of this one. But we may be second. We're not going to be last in this. So we're taking some pages from their playbook. We have some ideas of our own in this. But this is an opportunity to seize, and we're going to seize it.
Yeah, I always say borrow from the best, right? Best ideas out there. It doesn't matter whose they are, as long as they're really good ideas, and utilize them. So I think that's great. In this vein, what do you see as future trends for the financial markets and regulation? Yeah. It kind of falls out of what you were just saying. Obviously.
Absolutely. I had a wonderful opportunity 2 years ago in 2015. Harvard Law School asked me to come up and give a lecture and to address what are the long-term major trends in this early part of the 21st century. And I identified 6, and I'll tell you what they are. The first is cyber security, cyber aggression, cyber warfare.
Yeah, with all the attacks we've seen
just in the last few days.
Yeah.
It's relentless, it's constant, it's growing, and it's got to be primary in our response as regulators for this market. Second, the digitization of markets, which we just talked about.
Right.
The exponential digital technologies are changing everything we do, from how we hail a taxi to how we travel to how we download music, and they're transforming our markets, and we've got to be up with that trend as well. The third is the increasing importance of monetary policy on trading markets. The prolonged 15 years of near zero interest rates we face have distorted values in markets, have an enormous impact on trading markets. And historically, we've always thought about markets on one hand, monetary policy separately. We've got to have a much more holistic approach to the interplay of monetary policy on market policy as we go forward. Fourth, the changing nature of liquidity in markets. We've seen a diminishment and a shallowness in trading liquidity in markets over the last few years. I believe in reg reform, and yet we cannot deny that some of the efforts of reg reform have been designed to solve for the problem of bank insolvency in the face of a crisis.
Right.
But risk is something that is never extinguished. It's always transformed. And as we've solved for one risk, I fear we've enhanced another risk, and that's a risk of trading liquidity.
I concur. I think the history of regulation is exactly how you just described it, because you create regulations and then it transforms the risk if you don't think about it fully and what the secondary, tertiary effects are.
Absolutely right. And so I think that's a trend that we're coming out of this. We don't know, but we may be coming out of this prolonged period of low interest rates, and we've got to ask ourselves what effect that has on trading markets. Fragmentation. Those of us that grew up in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, thought about a globalization of the world. And we certainly saw it in financial services. Financial services became global, and it was a world of rising expectations, rising incomes. We seem to be in a period of reversing of that. We're going from a globalization to a fragmentation of global markets. Again, another byproduct that was unintended of some of the reg reform efforts has been to create what was once global markets of financial services have refragmented. We had a European-wide one. Now we may have a continental European and a separate British one, a separate North American one, a separate Asian one. That's a trend we've got to watch very carefully. And then sixth and lastly, identified a trend of consolidation. We had 24 large money center banks. We've got a dozen today, 6 of which are American. We are seeing consolidation across the financial landscape. We have less public companies. We went from 8,000, we're down to 4,500. We've got less banking services throughout the food chain. In our area, futures commission merchants, less future commission merchants. So a lot of consolidation going on in the market. The bigger getting bigger and the small are being wiped out. And that's a trend as well that I think has serious ramifications, and we need to be on it. So I think those are the 6 major trends we're seeing, and they all have different antecedents and different issues involved in them.
Well, to that point, these all sound like variations of different challenges.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
as you come into this agency, you've been here a while, you've seen it, you've kicked the tires quite a bit. You know what's going on here. What do you think are the top challenges for you as you come into this role?
So one is internal and one is external. The internal one is just sound regulatory work. It's producing good policy based on solid evidence and data, not on anecdotes. We've got to generate rules that work, rules that are well balanced.
Simple blocking and tackling.
Simple
right?
blocking and tackling. There's been a period of time where we rushed rules out the door, and some of them really, could have been better designed. We've got to get it right. We've got to make it work, which is why these visits to people that use our market is so important. And then the second part of that is what I call the external. More and more other agencies have it, because it's a connected world. Other agencies have an impact on our markets, but they will be making the policy. And so we've got to use forums like the Financial Stability Oversight Council that we're a member of, and other global bodies to influence other regulators to get their rules right to the extent they impact our market. So we've got to have an inside game and an outside game.
Wow, that's pretty challenging. Well, before I let you go, I always like to ask our people that come on the show, as you look back over your career, what do you think are the top 3 things you've learned?
So I'd say people matter. If you're not engaged with people, if you're not, whether it's leading an institution or trying to develop good regulatory policy, it starts with talking to the people involved and understanding them, understanding the concern. Second thing is experience matters. You've got to have lived through a few crisis cycles.
Some scars. Some tire treads on your back.
Yeah. And then also, youth and energy matter as well. I just met with a group of our summer interns here at the CFTC, and I told them, I said, look, we need you. We need your ideas. We need your energy. We need your familiarity with technology. We need your enthusiasm to refresh us so we can balance our experience, with your vitality and your enthusiasm for a changing world. The only thing that's constant is change. We want to be comfortable with that change. We want to get ahead of that change.
Chris Giancarlo, Acting Chairman of the CFTC. Thanks for coming on the show today.
And it was a pleasure.
That's it for me. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with more great guests. I'm Andy Bush. This has been CFTC Talks. But wait, there's more. Disclaimer time. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service and is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in the podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provided similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guest in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to the accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated and referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing this interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting future outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult with an attorney.